In the silence of the American night, beneath endless plains and ancient mountains, lies a history far older and far more complex than most people were ever taught. Long before the rise of modern nations, before Columbus crossed the Atlantic, before European empires carved borders across the continent, the Americas were already alive with civilizations, cultures, trade networks, and sacred traditions stretching back thousands of years. Forests echoed with the songs of nations whose names have nearly vanished from memory. Rivers carried merchants between cities larger than medieval capitals in Europe. Across deserts, mountains, and grasslands, entire worlds flourished beneath the stars. Yet for generations, history told a different story. Native Americans were often portrayed as scattered tribes wandering through untouched wilderness, primitive hunters living outside the boundaries of civilization. In schoolbooks, films, and popular imagination, they became simplified shadows of the past, isolated peoples destined to disappear before the march of modern history. But what if that image was incomplete? What if the real story of the first peoples of the Americas was far more astonishing than most of us realize? Because hidden beneath layers of myth and historical erasure lies another reality entirely. The civilizations of the Americas built vast cities, engineered landscapes, developed sophisticated systems of government, studied astronomy, practiced advanced agriculture, and maintained trade routes spanning entire continents. From the towering pyramids of Cahokia to the canals of Tenochtitlan, from the astronomical knowledge of the Maya to the political alliances of the Iroquois Confederacy, native societies shaped the land in ways European settlers often failed, or refused, to understand. And before colonization reshaped the hemisphere forever, the Americas were not empty wildernesses waiting to be discovered. They were densely populated worlds filled with millions of people whose histories stretched deep into antiquity. Then came catastrophe. Disease swept across continents with terrifying speed. Empires collapsed. Entire communities vanished before Europeans ever saw them. Conquest, forced assimilation, broken treaties, massacres, and propaganda slowly erased countless memories from public history. Over time, much of Native America became hidden beneath silence, stereotypes, and misunderstanding. But the story never truly ended. Because this is not only a documentary about the past, it is a story about survival. About cultures that endured despite centuries of destruction. About identities that refused to disappear. And about a history far older, deeper, and more powerful than the world was ever taught to see. Tonight, we journey into the forgotten history of the first peoples of the Americas. Not as myths, not as relics, but as civilizations that helped shape the human story itself. Long before the rise of Egypt's pyramids, before the first cities of Mesopotamia, and before the earliest dynasties of China, small groups of humans were already beginning one of the greatest journeys in human history. During the last ice age, much of the northern world was locked beneath enormous glaciers stretching across entire continents. Sea levels were dramatically lower than they are today, exposing vast regions of land now hidden beneath the ocean. Between Siberia and Alaska emerged a frozen expanse known as Beringia, the great land bridge that connected Asia to the Americas. For generations, historians believed this bridge explained the origins of the first Americans. According to the traditional theory, ancient hunters from Siberia crossed into Alaska around 13,000 years ago near the end of the Ice Age. These people became known through archaeology as the Clovis culture, identified by their distinctive stone spear points discovered across North America. For decades, many scholars believed the Clovis people were the first humans to enter the Americas. But history, like the Earth itself, often hides deeper layers beneath the surface. Over time, archaeologists began uncovering evidence that challenged everything once considered certain. Ancient campsites, tools, footprints, and human remains suggested people may have lived in the Americas thousands of years earlier than previously imagined. Sites in North and South America revealed traces of human activity dating back perhaps 20,000 years or more, long before the Clovis culture appeared. Suddenly, one of humanity's oldest mysteries grew even more complex. How did these early people arrive? Some researchers propose that the first Americans did not travel only through inland ice corridors, but instead followed the Pacific coastline using primitive boats and shoreline routes. During the Ice Age, coastal regions now submerged beneath rising oceans may once have supported early human migration southward along the edge of the continent. If true, entire chapters of human history may now lie hidden beneath the sea. Genetic studies added even more mystery to the story. DNA evidence revealed that the peopling of the Americas was not a single migration but likely multiple waves of movement unfolding across thousands of years. Different groups spread across vast distances, adapting to radically different environments. Some settled frozen northern tundras. Others crossed endless plains filled with mammoths and giant Ice Age animals. Over generations, humans reached deserts, forests, mountains and tropical jungles stretching from Alaska to the southern tip of South America. It was one of the greatest expansions in human existence. And it happened long before written history began. As centuries passed, these early peoples developed unique languages, spiritual beliefs, technologies and cultural traditions deeply connected to the lands around them. They learned the rhythms of rivers, the migrations of animals, the movements of stars, and the changing seasons of enormous continents. Survival demanded extraordinary intelligence, adaptability and cooperation. These were not primitive wanderers lost in wilderness. They were pioneers entering entirely new worlds. Archaeological discoveries continue to reshape our understanding of this ancient past. In White Sands, New Mexico, fossilized human footprints discovered beneath layers of sediment suggested human presence possibly more than 20,000 years ago. Other discoveries in caves, river valleys, and ancient campsites across the Americas hint that the story of the first Americans may stretch even further into prehistory than currently understood. The deeper scientists search, the older the mystery becomes. And yet, despite growing evidence, much of this history remains uncertain. Ice Age coastlines disappeared beneath rising seas. Organic materials decayed across millennia. Entire cultures vanished long before written records could preserve their memory. What survives are fragments, tools buried beneath earth, ancient bones, forgotten fires, and traces of footsteps frozen in time. But even those fragments reveal something extraordinary. By the time the great civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia were still in their infancy, human societies had already spread across the Americas for thousands upon thousands of years. Entire generations lived and died beneath these skies while the rest of the world remained unaware that another hemisphere even existed. The first peoples of the Americas were not recent arrivals in history. They were among humanity's oldest surviving civilizations. And their journey had only just begun. For centuries, one powerful myth shaped how much of the world viewed the Americas before European arrival. According to this belief, the continents were vast empty wildernesses inhabited only by scattered tribes living simple lives far removed from civilization. European explorers described endless forests, open plains and untouched nature stretching beyond the horizon. Over time, these descriptions became deeply embedded in popular history. But the truth was far more extraordinary. Long before Columbus crossed the Atlantic in 1492, the Americas were already home to great cities, advanced societies, massive trade networks and millions of people. Entire civilizations flourished across North and South America while Europe still struggled through parts of the medieval age. Hidden beneath forests, deserts, and modern cities lie the remains of urban worlds that many people today barely know existed. One of the most astonishing examples rose beside the Mississippi River near present-day St. Louis. Its name was Cahokia. At its height around the 11th century, Cahokia may have been the largest city north of Mexico. Tens of thousands of people lived there surrounded by massive earthen pyramids, ceremonial plazas, homes, workshops, and agricultural fields. At the center stood Monk's Mound, an enormous pyramid built entirely by human labor using baskets of earth carried by hand. The structure remains one of the largest prehistoric earthworks ever constructed in the Americas. For generations, many Americans passed near Cahokia without realizing an ancient metropolis once stood there. Yet Cahokia was only one part of a much larger forgotten world. Farther south, deep within the jungles of Central America, the Maya civilization rose centuries before European contact. The Maya built towering stone cities filled with pyramids, observatories, temples, and palaces carved with astonishing artistic detail. Cities such as Tikal, Palenque, Copan, and Chichen Itza became centers of science, religion, trade, and political power. The Maya were not merely builders. They were mathematicians and astronomers of extraordinary sophistication. Using careful observation of the heavens, Maya scholars tracked planetary movements, solar cycles, eclipses, and complex calendars with remarkable precision. They developed one of the few fully realized writing systems in the ancient Americas and recorded history in stone inscriptions and sacred books. Their understanding of mathematics even included the concept of zero centuries before it became common in Europe. And still, the great cities of the Americas continued rising. In the Valley of Mexico stood Tenochtitlan, capital of the Aztec Empire. Built upon an island within Lake Texcoco, the city stunned Spanish conquistadors when they first encountered it. Vast canals crossed through crowded districts filled with markets, temples, gardens and causeways connecting the island to the mainland. Floating agricultural systems known as chinampas produced enormous quantities of food from the surrounding waters. Some historians believe Tenochtitlan may have rivaled or exceeded the population of many European cities at the time. Spanish soldiers arriving from Europe described markets containing thousands of merchants trading gold, textiles, pottery, cacao, weapons, food and exotic goods from distant lands. To many Europeans, the city seemed almost unreal, a shining metropolis emerging from the water itself. And high within the Andes Mountains, another civilization mastered one of the harshest environments on Earth. The Inca Empire stretched across enormous distances of South America connected by thousands of miles of roads, bridges, stairways and mountain engineering projects. Without iron tools, horses or wheeled transport, the Inca constructed stone cities and agricultural terraces of astonishing precision. Their roads crossed deserts, jungles and towering mountains, linking vast regions into a unified imperial network. At Machu Picchu, massive stone blocks fit together so perfectly that even modern blades struggle to slide between them. The engineering still amazes archaeologists today. But perhaps most remarkable of all was the interconnectedness of these worlds. Trade networks stretched across enormous distances throughout the Americas long before European arrival. Copper from the Great Lakes, shells from distant coasts, obsidian from volcanic regions, feathers, food crops, textiles, and ceremonial objects moved between societies through systems of exchange connecting countless communities. The Americas were never isolated fragments of humanity. They were deeply connected civilizations. So why did the myth of empty wilderness survive for so long? Part of the answer lies in catastrophe. By the time many Europeans explored deeper into the continents, disease had already devastated countless native populations. Smallpox, measles, influenza, and other epidemics spread faster than colonizers themselves, collapsing cities and villages before outsiders even arrived. Entire societies weakened or vanished within generations. Europeans often encountered lands already transformed by disaster and mistakenly assumed they had always been sparsely populated. Colonial narratives also benefited from minimizing native achievement. If the land appeared empty or uncivilized, conquest became easier to justify. The complexity of native societies was ignored, misunderstood, or deliberately erased from mainstream history. Yet the ruins remained. Beneath forests and modern cities, traces of forgotten urban civilizations survived waiting to be rediscovered. Today, archaeologists using technology such as aerial LiDAR scanning continue uncovering hidden cities beneath dense jungle canopies across the Americas. Ancient roads, pyramids, reservoirs, farms, and entire urban networks are emerging from landscapes once thought untouched. The deeper we look into the past, the clearer the truth becomes. The Americas before Columbus were not empty wildernesses waiting to be discovered. They were worlds already filled with civilization. For centuries, many people imagined the Americas before European arrival as untouched wilderness, a vast natural world unshaped by human hands. Endless forests, open plains, towering mountains, and dense jungles appeared wild and empty to early colonizers. But modern archaeology, ecology, and indigenous knowledge reveal a very different reality. Long before Europeans arrived, native peoples across the Americas were actively shaping entire landscapes. They were not merely surviving in nature. They were engineering it. Across North America, indigenous communities carefully managed forests using controlled burning techniques developed over countless generations. Small, intentional fires cleared undergrowth, encouraged the growth of useful plants, improved hunting conditions, and prevented the massive uncontrollable wildfires that plague many regions today. What European settlers later believed were untouched forests had often been carefully maintained ecosystems shaped through human knowledge and environmental balance. The land itself had become part of a sophisticated relationship between people and nature. In the eastern woodlands, controlled fires created open forests where animals such as deer and bison could thrive. Along the Great Plains, native hunters influenced buffalo migration patterns and grassland ecology. In dry regions of the American Southwest, complex irrigation canals carried precious water across harsh desert environments, allowing large agricultural communities to survive where outsiders saw only barren land. Farther south, ancient civilizations transformed agriculture itself. Indigenous farmers developed some of the most important food crops in human history: maize, potatoes, beans, squash, tomatoes, cacao, and countless varieties of peppers and plants that would eventually feed much of the world. Corn alone became one of humanity's most influential agricultural innovations. Through generations of selective breeding, native farmers transformed wild grasses into highly productive crops capable of sustaining massive populations. Entire civilizations rose from this agricultural knowledge. But perhaps one of the greatest mysteries lies hidden within the Amazon rainforest. For generations, scientists believed the Amazon was too poor in soil to support large civilizations. The rainforest appeared wild, untouched, and impossible for dense human settlement. Yet recent discoveries are changing that view dramatically. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence of vast ancient settlements, roads, geometric earthworks, and engineered landscapes buried beneath the jungle canopy. Even more astonishing was the discovery of terra preta, rich black soil created artificially by indigenous peoples centuries ago. By mixing charcoal, organic waste, and nutrients into the earth, ancient Amazonians produced fertile soil capable of supporting long-term agriculture in regions once thought impossible to cultivate. The rainforest itself may have been partially shaped by human civilization. Across North America, enormous earthworks also revealed extraordinary engineering skill. Ancient cultures built massive ceremonial mounds and geometric structures aligned with celestial movements and spiritual beliefs. One of the most famous examples is the Great Serpent Mound in present-day Ohio, a gigantic serpent-shaped earthwork stretching across the landscape with astonishing precision. Its purpose remains mysterious even today. Elsewhere, enormous platform mounds, ceremonial plazas, and engineered settlements demonstrated careful planning and social organization. These projects required labor coordination, mathematics, astronomy, and generations of accumulated knowledge. Water management became another hallmark of indigenous engineering. In wetlands and river systems, native societies created fish traps, canals, raised agricultural fields, reservoirs, and flood control systems adapted perfectly to local environments. In the Andes, mountain civilizations carved agricultural terraces into steep slopes to maximize food production while preventing erosion. In desert regions, irrigation systems transformed dry landscapes into productive farmland. None of this was accidental. It reflected deep scientific understanding passed through oral traditions over centuries. But unlike industrial civilizations that often sought domination over nature, many indigenous societies viewed the environment as sacred, something humans belonged to rather than controlled completely. Spiritual beliefs emphasized balance, reciprocity, and responsibility toward the natural world. Forests, rivers, animals, and mountains were often seen as living parts of interconnected systems deserving respect. This relationship helped sustain societies for generations. Then came colonization. Disease and population collapse disrupted many indigenous land management systems. Controlled burns stopped in numerous regions. Agricultural networks vanished. Forests reclaimed abandoned settlements. Europeans arriving after these collapses often mistook the changed landscapes for untouched wilderness rather than environments shaped for thousands of years by human civilization. The illusion of an empty continent was born partly from catastrophe itself. Today, modern scientists increasingly recognize how advanced indigenous environmental knowledge truly was. Practices once dismissed as primitive are now studied for insights into sustainable agriculture, wildfire prevention, biodiversity, and ecological balance. The deeper researchers investigate the ancient Americas, the clearer one truth becomes. The first peoples of the Americas were not passive inhabitants of nature. They were engineers of entire worlds. Before the arrival of Europeans, the Americas were alive with millions of people spread across forests, plains, deserts, mountains, and river valleys. Vast trade networks connected distant societies. Great cities rose beside lakes and jungles. Farms stretched across fertile lands carefully cultivated for generations. Entire civilizations flourished across two continents long before the outside world even knew they existed. Then, within only a few generations, much of that world vanished. What followed after European contact became one of the greatest demographic catastrophes in human history. When Christopher Columbus arrived in the Caribbean in 1492, neither Europeans nor native peoples understood the invisible danger crossing the ocean with them. Smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, and other diseases carried unknowingly by Europeans would spread across the Americas with terrifying speed. Indigenous populations had no immunity to these illnesses because they had evolved separately from Eurasian and African disease environments for thousands of years. The consequences were catastrophic beyond imagination. Entire villages fell silent within weeks. Families disappeared almost overnight. Communities that had survived for centuries suddenly collapsed beneath waves of sickness no healer could explain. In many regions, the diseases spread faster than the colonizers themselves. Trade routes, migration paths, and communication networks unknowingly carried epidemics deep into the continents before Europeans physically arrived. Some native societies encountered devastation before ever seeing a single European face. To survivors, it must have felt like the world itself was ending. Spanish accounts from the early colonial era described horrifying scenes of abandoned homes, mass graves, starving children, and entire settlements emptied by disease. In parts of Central and South America, population losses reached staggering levels. Historians estimate that in some regions up to 90% of indigenous populations may have died within the first centuries after contact. The scale of death is almost impossible to comprehend. Modern scholars believe the population of the Americas before colonization may have reached tens of millions of people, perhaps even over 100 million across North and South America combined. Within a relatively short historical period, much of that population disappeared. Cities weakened. Agricultural systems collapsed. Trade networks vanished. Sacred knowledge passed through elders was suddenly lost forever. Because the dead were not only individuals. They were libraries of memory. In many indigenous societies, history, law, spirituality, medicine, astronomy, and cultural identity were preserved through oral tradition passed from generation to generation. When elders died in massive numbers, entire worlds of knowledge disappeared with them. Songs, stories, ceremonies, and histories vanished before they could ever be recorded. Then came conquest. European colonization did not stop with disease alone. Military campaigns, forced labor systems, slavery, massacres, land seizure, and violent displacement intensified the destruction already unfolding across the continents. In the Caribbean, entire indigenous populations were pushed toward extinction within decades. In Mesoamerica and South America, Spanish conquest shattered massive empires already weakened by epidemics. In North America, waves of colonization gradually pushed indigenous nations from ancestral lands through warfare, broken treaties, forced migration, and settlement expansion. The psychological impact was equally devastating. To many native communities, disease and conquest seemed almost supernatural in scale. Spiritual systems struggled to explain why entire populations were dying so suddenly. Ancient political orders fractured beneath the pressure of collapse. Alliances shifted. Fear spread across enormous distances. Some regions became ghost landscapes. Fields once filled with crops returned to wilderness. Roads disappeared beneath forests. Cities emptied. And when later European settlers encountered these quieter landscapes generations afterward, many assumed the land had always been sparsely populated. This misunderstanding helped create one of history's most enduring myths, the idea that the Americas were mostly empty wilderness before European settlement. But the emptiness itself was often the result of catastrophe. The forests Europeans described as untouched may have grown over abandoned farms and villages. The open lands settlers claimed had often been shaped for centuries by indigenous agriculture and environmental management before disease collapsed the populations maintaining them. Even climate itself may have changed because of the disaster. Some scientists believe the massive population decline across the Americas allowed forests to regrow on abandoned agricultural land, absorbing enough carbon dioxide to contribute slightly to global cooling during parts of the Little Ice Age. The deaths of millions may have altered the planet itself. Yet despite unimaginable destruction, indigenous peoples did not disappear. Survivors adapted. Communities rebuilt. Cultures endured through grief, displacement, and centuries of violence. And while countless histories were erased forever, fragments remained alive in language, ceremony, memory, and descendants who refused to let their civilizations vanish completely. Today, archaeologists, historians, and indigenous scholars continue uncovering the true scale of what was lost after contact. The more evidence emerges, the clearer the picture becomes. The Americas before colonization were not empty frontiers waiting for civilization. They were worlds devastated by one of the greatest population collapses humanity has ever witnessed. When European colonizers first arrived in the Americas, many assumed native societies lacked organized political systems. To outsiders unfamiliar with indigenous traditions, the continent appeared divided into scattered tribes governed only by warfare or survival. But beneath this misunderstanding existed political structures of remarkable sophistication, systems built upon diplomacy, balance, collective responsibility, and forms of governance that still fascinate historians today. Long before modern democracies emerged in Europe or America, many indigenous nations had already developed highly organized systems of law and leadership. Among the most influential was the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, often known today as the Iroquois Confederacy. Formed centuries before the creation of the United States, the Confederacy united multiple nations, including the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and later the Tuscarora, into one of the most sophisticated political alliances in early North America. According to oral tradition, the Confederacy was founded after generations of violent conflict between nations. A spiritual leader known as the Great Peacemaker, along with leaders such as Hiawatha, helped establish a new system based not on endless war, but on unity and consensus. The result became known as the Great Law of Peace. It was more than a political agreement. It was a philosophy of governance. Under this system, individual nations maintained their own leadership and traditions while cooperating through councils that sought collective decisions. Important matters were debated carefully among representatives, with emphasis placed on discussion, persuasion, and long-term harmony rather than the absolute rule of kings. In many ways, the structure resembled a federation centuries before similar political ideas spread widely in Europe. Perhaps even more remarkable was the role of women within many indigenous political systems. In Haudenosaunee society, clan mothers held enormous influence. They selected and could remove male chiefs if leaders acted selfishly or dishonorably. Leadership was viewed not as personal power, but as responsibility toward the community. Wisdom, diplomacy, generosity, and the ability to maintain balance were valued above domination. This differed sharply from many European monarchies of the time, where kings often ruled through inherited authority and centralized control. Across the Americas, political systems varied enormously between nations and regions. Some societies developed confederacies and alliances spanning large territories. Others governed through councils of elders, spiritual leaders, or hereditary chiefs balanced by communal traditions. Complex systems of law regulated trade, diplomacy, marriage, territory, and conflict resolution. Far from being politically primitive, many native societies maintained intricate systems adapted perfectly to their environments and cultures. Diplomacy became one of the most important tools of survival. Native nations negotiated alliances not only with each other, but later with competing European empires including Britain, France, and Spain. Skilled diplomats navigated shifting political landscapes with extraordinary intelligence, often playing rival colonial powers against one another to preserve independence and territory. Some indigenous leaders became master negotiators capable of speaking multiple languages and understanding foreign political systems better than the colonizers understood theirs. And there remains another fascinating question historians still debate today. Did native political ideas influence modern democracy itself? Some scholars argue that early American thinkers, including figures connected to the founding of the United States, observed aspects of indigenous governance, particularly the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, while developing ideas about federalism and union between states. Although the extent of this influence remains debated, there is little doubt that European colonists encountered functioning political systems in the Americas that challenged assumptions about governance and liberty. Benjamin Franklin himself admired aspects of indigenous diplomacy and unity between nations. Yet despite this sophistication, colonial narratives often ignored or minimized native political achievements. European observers frequently misunderstood consensus-based governance because it did not resemble centralized monarchies familiar to them. Systems built around discussion and collective responsibility were sometimes dismissed as weak or disorganized simply because they operated differently from European traditions. This misunderstanding carried devastating consequences during colonization. Treaties between native nations and colonial governments were often negotiated under completely different cultural assumptions. Many indigenous societies viewed treaties as sacred agreements establishing long-term relationships and mutual obligations. Colonial powers, however, frequently treated them as temporary political tools to be broken whenever convenient. Again and again promises were violated. Land was seized. Alliances shattered. And yet indigenous political systems endured despite centuries of pressure. Even after forced removals, warfare, assimilation policies, and cultural suppression, many native nations preserved their systems of governance into the modern era. Tribal governments today continue exercising sovereignty, maintaining legal traditions and protecting cultural identity across North America. The deeper historians study indigenous political systems, the harder it becomes to maintain old stereotypes about primitive tribes. Because long before modern democracies claimed to champion liberty and representation, native nations across the Americas had already developed complex systems built upon diplomacy, balance, law, and collective responsibility. Political genius existed here long before the modern world learned to recognize it. For centuries, many outsiders viewed Native American societies through the narrow lens of European civilization, assuming the peoples of the Americas lacked advanced scientific understanding or intellectual traditions. But beneath this misconception existed vast systems of knowledge built over thousands of years through observation, experimentation, memory, and deep connection to the natural world. Long before modern laboratories and universities emerged in Europe, indigenous peoples across the Americas had already developed sophisticated knowledge systems that shaped medicine, agriculture, astronomy, engineering, and environmental science. Their discoveries would eventually change the world itself. Among the most remarkable achievements was indigenous medicine. Across North and South America, native healers possessed extensive understanding of medicinal plants, herbal treatments, surgery, pain relief, and natural therapies passed through generations of oral tradition. Shamans, medicine people, and healers carefully studied the properties of roots, bark, leaves, fungi, and minerals found within local ecosystems. Different nations developed complex healing practices adapted to their environments and spiritual beliefs. Some indigenous medicines later became foundations for modern pharmaceutical science. For example, quinine, derived from the bark of the cinchona tree and used to treat malaria, originated from indigenous knowledge in South America. Willow bark, traditionally used for pain relief by various native peoples, contains compounds related to aspirin. Countless botanical remedies known to indigenous healers were later studied and adopted by European medicine. But indigenous science extended far beyond healing. Agriculture became one of humanity's greatest transformations, and Native American civilizations played a central role in that revolution. Indigenous farmers domesticated crops that today feed billions of people worldwide. Corn, potatoes, tomatoes, cacao, peanuts, beans, squash, chili peppers, cassava, vanilla, and many other foods originated in the Americas long before European contact. The impact on global history cannot be overstated. Potatoes from the Andes helped sustain massive population growth in Europe and Asia. Corn spread across continents, becoming one of the world's most important food sources. Tomatoes transformed cuisines from Italy to the Middle East. Chocolate, once a sacred ceremonial drink among Mesoamerican civilizations, eventually became a global industry. Modern civilization still eats from indigenous innovation every single day. Astronomy also occupied a sacred and scientific place in many native societies. The Maya became especially renowned for their astonishing understanding of celestial movement. Through careful observation across centuries, Maya astronomers tracked planetary cycles, eclipses, solar years, and seasonal changes with extraordinary precision. Massive observatories aligned with the heavens allowed priests and scholars to predict astronomical events and maintain highly accurate calendar systems. Without telescopes or modern instruments, they mapped the sky with remarkable accuracy. Other indigenous cultures across the Americas also aligned temples, earthworks, ceremonial centers, and cities with celestial events such as solstices, equinoxes, and star patterns. Astronomy guided agriculture, ceremonies, navigation, and spiritual life. Engineering and architecture reflected similar brilliance. In the Andes Mountains, Inca builders designed stone structures capable of withstanding earthquakes through flexible masonry techniques that still amaze engineers today. Massive stones were cut and fitted together so precisely that many structures survived centuries of seismic activity. In desert regions, indigenous irrigation systems transformed harsh landscapes into productive agricultural zones. In wetlands, native societies created raised fields and water management systems adapted perfectly to local ecosystems. Across North America, mound-building cultures engineered enormous ceremonial earthworks requiring mathematical planning and coordinated labor. And yet much of this knowledge was preserved without written books. Instead, indigenous civilizations maintained vast oral knowledge systems. Histories, scientific understanding, laws, genealogies, astronomy, medicine, and spiritual teachings passed through storytelling, ritual, songs, memory training, and apprenticeships. Elders became living libraries carrying generations of accumulated wisdom. To Europeans accustomed to written records, these oral traditions were often misunderstood or dismissed. But oral knowledge systems proved extraordinarily durable. Many preserved accurate environmental and historical information across centuries, sometimes even recording memories of ancient floods, volcanic eruptions, migrations, and climate changes later supported by modern science. Then colonization disrupted these systems. Disease, warfare, forced assimilation, missionary campaigns, and boarding schools shattered many traditional knowledge networks. Sacred practices were outlawed. Languages disappeared. Elders died before passing knowledge to younger generations. European colonizers frequently dismissed indigenous science as superstition while simultaneously adopting native agricultural methods, medicines, and survival techniques. Entire worlds of knowledge were nearly lost. Yet much survived. Today, indigenous scholars, scientists, healers, and communities are reclaiming traditional knowledge systems once pushed toward extinction. Modern researchers increasingly recognize the value of indigenous ecological understanding, sustainable agriculture, medicine, climate knowledge, and environmental stewardship. The deeper the world studies indigenous civilizations, the clearer one truth becomes. The first peoples of the Americas were not isolated from science or intellectual achievement. They carried knowledge systems built across thousands of years, systems that helped shape the modern world in ways history is only beginning to fully understand. From the moment European ships first appeared along the shores of the Americas, indigenous nations faced a challenge unlike anything in their history. Foreign empires arrived carrying unfamiliar weapons, strange diseases, powerful religions, and endless hunger for land. Across forests, plains, deserts, and mountains, native peoples were forced into a centuries-long struggle for survival. But the story of indigenous America was never only one of victimhood. It was also a story of resistance. Of warriors, diplomats, leaders, and nations that refused to disappear quietly. For generations, native societies adapted to the rapidly changing world around them. Some nations sought alliances with European powers to protect themselves against rival tribes or expanding colonies. Others attempted peaceful coexistence through treaties and diplomacy. Many fought fiercely to defend their homelands from invasion. Again and again, indigenous nations demonstrated extraordinary resilience, military skill, and political intelligence. In the woodlands of eastern North America, confederacies such as the Haudenosaunee navigated a dangerous world of competing European empires. French, British, Spanish, and later American governments all sought native alliances during wars that reshaped the continent. Indigenous diplomats often became masters of negotiation, balancing relationships between rival powers while trying to preserve their independence. Some native leaders spoke multiple languages and understood European politics better than many Europeans understood indigenous societies. Yet diplomacy alone could not stop expansion forever. As colonial settlements grew, conflict intensified across the continent. Land hunger drove settlers deeper into indigenous territories. Treaties were signed and broken repeatedly. Forests were cleared, rivers seized, and sacred hunting grounds destroyed. For many native nations, resistance became a matter of survival itself. Among the most legendary resistance leaders was Tecumseh, the Shawnee warrior and statesman who dreamed of uniting indigenous nations into a vast alliance capable of resisting American expansion. Traveling across enormous distances, Tecumseh urged tribes to stand together against the loss of their lands. He understood a terrifying truth: divided nations could be conquered one by one. Though his confederacy ultimately failed after the War of 1812, Tecumseh became a symbol of indigenous unity and resistance that endured long after his death. Farther west, the Great Plains became the stage for some of the most famous conflicts in Native American history. Nations such as the Lakota, Cheyenne, Comanche, Apache, and many others developed highly mobile warrior cultures centered around horses introduced by Europeans centuries earlier. Master horsemen transformed warfare across the plains with extraordinary speed and tactical skill. The horse changed everything. Mounted warriors could travel enormous distances, hunt buffalo more efficiently, and resist colonial armies with terrifying mobility. Some indigenous nations became so powerful that European settlers and governments feared entering their territories. Leaders such as Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, and Geronimo became legendary figures of resistance. Sitting Bull inspired unity among Lakota and allied nations during the growing crisis of westward expansion. Crazy Horse emerged as one of the greatest battlefield commanders of the Plains Wars, helping lead native forces during the famous Battle of the Little Bighorn, where combined indigenous warriors defeated Lieutenant Colonel George Custer and the U.S. 7th Cavalry. For a moment, it seemed possible that resistance might succeed. But industrial expansion, railroads, repeating firearms, and the relentless growth of the United States slowly overwhelmed indigenous military power. Buffalo populations, central to the survival of many Plains nations, were slaughtered in massive numbers, destroying both food sources and ways of life. Hunger became a weapon of conquest. Elsewhere, Apache leader Geronimo led years of resistance across the deserts and mountains of the American Southwest. Small groups of Apache fighters used deep knowledge of terrain to evade far larger armies for years. Their endurance became legendary even among their enemies. And throughout all these conflicts, one painful pattern repeated endlessly. Promises were broken. Treaties guaranteeing land and peace were violated whenever settlers demanded more territory. Entire nations were forced from ancestral homelands through violence and coercion. The trail of tears, forced relocations, massacres and reservation systems shattered countless communities across North America. Yet even in defeat, indigenous resistance never truly ended. Because survival itself became resistance. Communities preserved languages in secret. Ceremonies continued despite bans and persecution. Oral histories survived through elders and families. Songs, traditions, spiritual beliefs, and identities endured through generations determined not to let their civilizations vanish completely. The image of Native Americans as passive victims of history ignores this enormous legacy of courage and resilience. These were nations that fought empires. Diplomats who negotiated with world powers. Warriors who defended their homelands against impossible odds. And leaders who understood that resistance was not only fought on battlefields, but through memory, identity, and survival itself. Even after centuries of conquest, indigenous peoples remain here today, still resisting erasure, still carrying the voices of their ancestors forward into the future. By the late 19th century, much of indigenous military resistance across North America had been crushed. Nations that once controlled vast territories were confined to reservations under government supervision. Buffalo herds had nearly vanished. Treaties had been broken. Traditional economies collapsed beneath colonial expansion. But even after conquest on the battlefield, another campaign was only beginning. This new war would target something far deeper than land. It would target identity itself. Across the United States and Canada, government officials increasingly believed indigenous cultures needed to be erased in order to fully absorb native peoples into colonial society. Many political leaders, missionaries, and reformers viewed native languages, spiritual traditions, family structures, and ways of life as obstacles to what they called civilization. Their solution became one of the darkest chapters in North American history: the boarding school system. Beginning in the late 1800s, thousands of Native American and First Nations children were forcibly removed from their families and sent to distant residential schools designed to strip away indigenous identity. Some children were taken through coercion or threats against parents. Others were transported hundreds of miles away from their communities, often never seeing home again for years. The philosophy behind the schools was brutally clear. One American official famously described the goal as, "Kill the Indian, save the man." Inside the schools, children entered a world built upon forced assimilation. Traditional clothing was confiscated. Long hair, often spiritually significant in many native cultures, was cut short. Indigenous names were replaced with English ones. Native languages were forbidden, and children caught speaking them were often beaten or severely punished. Ceremonies, songs, and spiritual practices became illegal within the schools. Everything connected to indigenous identity was treated as something shameful that needed to disappear. The emotional trauma was immense. Children who had grown up surrounded by family, elders, and traditional culture suddenly found themselves isolated in harsh institutional environments where affection, language, and cultural memory were systematically suppressed. Many suffered physical abuse, malnutrition, forced labor, disease, and emotional cruelty. Some never returned home at all. Families across generations carried the wounds of separation. The schools did not simply target individuals. They targeted continuity itself. For countless indigenous societies, knowledge passed from elders to younger generations through stories, ceremonies, language, and communal life. Boarding schools interrupted this transfer of memory. Children raised away from their traditions often struggled to reconnect with their cultures later in life. Entire languages moved closer to extinction as fewer young people learned to speak them. The consequences echoed across generations. Communities faced cycles of trauma, cultural loss, and fractured identity that continued long after many schools closed. Parents who had endured abuse within the system sometimes struggled emotionally when raising their own children. Shame surrounding indigenous identity became deeply embedded in some communities through decades of forced assimilation policies. And yet, despite everything, indigenous cultures survived. Many families resisted quietly in whatever ways they could. Elders continued teaching languages in secret. Ceremonies survived underground despite bans and persecution. Oral traditions endured through whispered stories passed carefully between generations determined not to let memory vanish completely. Survival itself became an act of resistance. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, investigations into boarding schools began revealing the true scale of suffering hidden for generations. Survivors shared painful testimonies describing abuse, neglect, loneliness, and cultural destruction inside the institutions. In both Canada and the United States, the discoveries of unmarked graves near former residential schools shocked the world and forced wider public recognition of this history. For many Indigenous communities, however, these truths were never hidden. They had carried the memory all along. Today, Native nations across North America are working to reclaim what the schools tried to erase. Languages once pushed toward extinction are being taught again. Traditional ceremonies are returning openly. Indigenous scholars, artists, teachers, and activists continue rebuilding cultural knowledge interrupted by generations of assimilation policies. The boarding school era remains one of the most painful chapters in Indigenous history. But it also reveals something extraordinary. Despite enormous efforts to destroy Native identity, the cultures endured. The songs survived. The languages survived. The people survived. And across North America today, descendants of those children continue carrying their ancestors' traditions forward, proving that even after generations of cultural assault, Indigenous identity could never be fully erased. For generations, millions of people around the world learned about Native Americans not from history books, Indigenous voices, or authentic traditions, but from movies. Hollywood helped create some of the most powerful and damaging myths ever attached to Indigenous peoples. Across old Western films, television shows, comic books, and popular media, Native Americans were often reduced to simplistic stereotypes. Savage warriors attacking settlers, silent hunters wandering empty plains, mystical shamans speaking in riddles, or tragic vanishing races, doomed to disappear before modern civilization. These images became deeply embedded in global culture. But they were never the full truth. In reality, Indigenous civilizations across the Americas were extraordinarily diverse. Before European contact, hundreds of nations existed across North and South America, each with distinct languages, political systems, religions, clothing, architecture, economies, and traditions. The cultures of the Inuit Arctic world differed completely from the civilizations of the Maya jungles, the horse nations of the Great Plains, or the agricultural societies of the eastern woodlands. There was never a single Native American culture. There were countless civilizations. Yet Hollywood often collapsed this complexity into one imaginary identity. Tribes from different centuries and regions were blended together into fictional portrayals designed more for entertainment than historical truth. Plains headdresses appeared on peoples who never wore them. Sacred traditions became props. Indigenous languages were ignored entirely. Native characters were frequently played by non-native actors using exaggerated accents and stereotypes. The result was a fantasy version of Indigenous America that overshadowed reality. One of the most enduring myths portrayed Native peoples as primitive obstacles standing in the path of progress. In countless Western films, settlers became heroic pioneers bringing civilization to empty wilderness, while Native nations appeared only as violent threats to expansion. Rarely did these stories acknowledge broken treaties, land theft, massacres, forced removals, or the destruction of Indigenous societies. History became simplified into a story of civilization versus savagery. But reality was far more complicated. Native societies possessed complex political systems, advanced agriculture, diplomacy, architecture, astronomy, medicine, and trade networks long before European colonization. Many Indigenous nations initially welcomed, traded with, or assisted European newcomers. Others attempted peaceful coexistence before expansion and violence shattered those relationships. Hollywood rarely showed this complexity. Another powerful myth was the idea of the vanishing Indian, the belief that Native Americans belonged only to the distant past. Throughout the 20th century, films and textbooks often portrayed Indigenous peoples as if they had disappeared after the frontier era ended. Modern Native communities became almost invisible within mainstream media. But Native Americans never vanished. They survived. Today, Indigenous nations continue living across the Americas, preserving languages, traditions, ceremonies, and identities despite centuries of colonization and assimilation. Millions of Native people remain active in politics, education, science, military service, environmental activism, filmmaking, literature, and art. Yet stereotypes continued causing real harm. Sports mascots and caricatures turned sacred identities into entertainment. Indigenous cultures were commercialized while Native voices themselves were often ignored. Many schools taught simplified versions of history that minimized colonial violence or presented Indigenous peoples only during early American history before abruptly removing them from the modern narrative. Even children grew up absorbing distorted images without realizing it. For decades, These portrayals shaped public understanding more powerfully than historical research. But change slowly began emerging. Indigenous writers, filmmakers, historians, activists, and scholars increasingly challenged these false narratives. Native creators started reclaiming control over their own stories through literature, documentaries, cinema, television, and digital media. Films and series created with indigenous involvement began presenting Native peoples as real human beings rather than stereotypes frozen in time. Audiences also began questioning older myths. Historians uncovered deeper truths about the sophistication of indigenous civilizations before colonization. Archaeology revealed ancient cities hidden beneath forests and deserts. Indigenous scholars brought oral traditions and native perspectives into academic research long dominated by colonial viewpoints. The story itself was changing. And perhaps the greatest myth of all was not about Native Americans. It was about history. Because history is never only a collection of facts. It is also a story about who gets remembered and who gets erased. For centuries, indigenous voices were pushed to the margins while outsiders defined Native identity through stereotypes, propaganda, and fiction. But today those voices are returning to the center of the narrative. Not as symbols, not as myths, but as living peoples carrying histories far older and more complex than Hollywood ever allowed the world to see. For centuries, many people were taught to see Native Americans only as figures of the distant past, civilizations that existed before colonization and slowly disappeared from history. Museums displayed ancient artifacts behind glass. Old Western films placed indigenous peoples in another century. Schoolbooks often ended Native history somewhere near the frontier era, as though the story itself had already concluded. But that story was never over. Native Americans are not relics of history. They are living nations, living cultures, and living communities continuing into the modern world. Across the United States, Canada, Mexico, and throughout the Americas, millions of indigenous people still preserve languages, ceremonies, traditions, and identities carried across generations despite centuries of conquest, forced assimilation, and cultural suppression. Today there are hundreds of federally recognized tribes in the United States alone, each with distinct histories, governments, spiritual traditions, and cultural practices. The survival of these nations is itself extraordinary. Because many indigenous communities endured not only war and disease, but also systematic efforts to erase their cultures completely. Boarding schools attempted to eliminate native languages. Ceremonies were outlawed. Sacred lands were seized. Families were separated. Entire generations grew up under pressure to abandon their identity in order to survive within colonial society. Yet despite everything, indigenous cultures endured. And now, across many communities, cultural revival is accelerating. Languages once endangered are being taught again to younger generations. Tribal schools, immersion programs, and digital archives help preserve words nearly lost after centuries of assimilation. Elders work beside teachers and activists to restore songs, oral histories, ceremonies, and traditional knowledge. For many Native communities, language is more than communication. It is memory itself. Each language carries unique ways of understanding the world, relationships with nature, spirituality, ancestry, and identity that cannot be translated fully into English or other colonial languages. Traditional arts are also experiencing revival. Indigenous beadwork, carving, weaving, music, dance, tattoo traditions, storytelling, and ceremonial practices continue evolving within modern society. Powwows and cultural gatherings bring together communities across enormous distances, blending ancient traditions with contemporary Native identity. At the same time, Native Americans remain deeply connected to modern political and social struggles. Many indigenous nations continue fighting for land rights, environmental protection, treaty recognition, healthcare, education, and economic justice. In numerous regions, Native communities face disproportionate poverty, addiction crises, inadequate infrastructure, and the lasting effects of historical trauma created through generations of colonization and forced assimilation. But indigenous activism has also become a powerful force in modern society. One of the most visible examples emerged during the Standing Rock protests in 2016, when thousands of indigenous activists and allies gathered to oppose the Dakota Access Pipeline near sacred lands and water sources. The movement drew international attention and symbolized broader indigenous struggles for sovereignty, environmental protection, and respect for treaty rights. For many Native activists, protecting the environment is inseparable from cultural survival itself. The land is not viewed merely as property. It is sacred. And indigenous ecological knowledge, developed across thousands of years, is increasingly recognized as valuable in addressing modern environmental crises such as climate change, wildfires, and biodiversity loss. Meanwhile, Native Americans continue contributing across every part of modern society. Indigenous leaders serve in government, universities, medicine, law, science, sports, filmmaking, literature, and military service. Native authors, historians, musicians, and artists are reshaping how Indigenous history is understood around the world. Most importantly, Native peoples are reclaiming the right to tell their own stories. For centuries, outsiders defined Indigenous identity through stereotypes, textbooks, films, and colonial narratives. Today, Native voices themselves increasingly stand at the center of historical storytelling, preserving perspectives once ignored or silenced. And this changes everything. Because the history of Native Americans is not simply a story about tragedy or disappearance. It is a story about endurance, about cultures surviving against impossible odds, about nations refusing to vanish, and about people carrying ancient traditions forward into a rapidly changing modern world. The first peoples of the Americas are still here, still speaking their languages, still defending their lands, still preserving the memory of their ancestors, and still shaping the future of the continents their civilizations helped define for thousands of years. For centuries, the history of the Americas was told through a narrow lens, one shaped largely by conquest, colonization, and the voices of those who wrote history after native civilizations had already suffered unimaginable devastation. Generations grew up believing the continents before Columbus were empty wildernesses populated only by scattered tribes living outside the boundaries of civilization. But the deeper we look into the past, the more that image begins to collapse. Because long before European ships crossed the Atlantic, the Americas were already filled with ancient societies, cities, trade networks, political systems, scientific knowledge, engineering achievements, and cultures stretching back thousands upon thousands of years. Entire civilizations rose beneath these skies while much of the outside world remained unaware they even existed. The first peoples of the Americas were never simply passive figures waiting to be discovered. They were explorers, builders, astronomers, farmers, diplomats, warriors, scientists, and guardians of knowledge passed across countless generations. Yet history changed violently after contact. Disease swept through continents with terrifying speed. Empires collapsed. Languages disappeared. Sacred traditions were attacked. Lands were seized. Children were taken from families. Entire cultures faced centuries of pressure designed to erase them from memory itself. And still, they survived. That survival may be the most extraordinary part of the story. Because despite conquest, forced assimilation, broken treaties, massacres, boarding schools, stereotypes, and centuries of historical erasure, indigenous peoples across the Americas never vanished. Their languages still echo across deserts, forests, plains, mountains, and Arctic tundra. Ceremonies continue beneath the same stars their ancestors once studied centuries ago. Songs once nearly silenced are being sung again by new generations reclaiming identity and memory. The story of Native Americans is not only about tragedy. It is also about resilience. About cultures refusing to disappear. About nations carrying ancient traditions into the modern world while continuing to shape the future around them. And perhaps most importantly, this history forces us to confront a deeper truth about the way human civilization remembers itself. History is never only about facts. It is about perspective. Who tells the story? Who gets remembered? And who gets forgotten? For centuries, indigenous voices were pushed to the edges of mainstream history while myths and stereotypes replaced reality. But today, archaeology, historical research, oral traditions, and indigenous scholarship are helping restore pieces of a far older and more complex picture of the Americas. A picture in which native civilizations were not footnotes to history, but central chapters of human civilization itself. The Americas did not begin with colonization. They did not begin in 1492. Their story stretches back into Ice Age migrations, ancient cities, sacred landscapes, and civilizations that shaped entire continents long before modern borders existed. And as we rediscover that forgotten world, we are forced to see history differently. Not as a simple story of discovery and expansion, but as a story of survival, memory, resilience, and civilizations that endured against impossible odds. Because the first peoples of the Americas are not lost remnants of the past. They are still here. And their story is still being written.